All that sorted. First film, please, guys.
Good to start? Panel. We live in a world where private incentives for companies exploit grieving families and exploit the grief of having your loved one die. Panel, 3 things in the speech. First of all, 2 points of setup, then an argument on why the funeral industry has, funeral companies have incentives to capitalize on grief, and how death is often an inelastic cost, just meaning price gouging goes up. And second, why government will do this well, and how this will solve it, and how this makes things much better for families who are grieving, and secondly, how it makes things much better for voters. First of all, in terms of setup, what is the impetus to actually nationalize? First of all, in the world of cost of living crisis, funerals are just incredibly expensive. 2 sub-points here. First of all, we know this as empirically true. Funerals cost so much. I think second of all, also funeral services are inelastic. It just means that everyone dies at some point, and when prices go up, demand still exists to the same level, which means that people are just willing to spend more, even if they have cost of living crisis, even if they can't afford it, because obviously you want to give your loved one as much comfort as possible, and also you obviously are just technically have to bury your loved one anyways. So even if you get the cheaper service, we think this service is in itself super expensive because companies price gauge. We think this happens in both large companies, which have kind of monopoly power, but we think even in smaller companies that kind of look at the market and they also match this pricing, and they also have the incentive of obviously getting profit. I think secondly, people and companies tend to exploit grief. I think grief is very powerful in those moments. I think thirdly, we actually see people in the funeral industry calling for change, so things like national certificates and things like that. I think fourthly, this just requires the government to step in because the problem is so huge, and introducing regulation, legislation, and actually nationalizing this industry. Second of all, what does this actual process look like? I think 5 things here. I think first of all, the context here is Western liberal democracies. So I think Australia, New Zealand, and USA, these are things where people actually governments will listen to voters. These are things where the media is quite transparent and quite powerful. I think secondly, it is done by governments at a federal level. What this actually looks like specifically, I think, first of all, just a lot greater legislation for this industry. I think, second of all, this, what these actually funeral services will will look like now. First of all, information packages actually describing what funeral services are compulsory and which ones are just extras. I think second of all, just greater information because governments obviously have the incentive to make their voters know as much as possible. I think thirdly, price caps. So we think currently we are some services which are under investigation by ACCC. But first of all, ACCC is toothless. We literally see lose battles against Commonwealth Bank every day. Second of all, I think ACCC is kind of like some vague body. It is not something which is like scrutinized by voters or by media as much because obviously there's a bunch of technocrats. Meanwhile, on the other side, we actually have elected governments which are electable. And I think thirdly, the process will actually take into perspective, so things like things like religious perspectives will be taken in, because obviously the government has incentives of being elected, and also the media will push them strongly in that. I think fourthly, what this actually looks like is much more transparency for who actually regulates the funeral industry and who's actually responsible for it. So obviously the government will say we're the ones in charge, and otherwise on the comparative, you're not really sure who's actually behind it, especially when companies have like things like shell corporations, when you have like really huge monopolies, and you have things like trademarks as well. Okay, now to my first substantive on why funeral companies actually have incentives to capitalize on grief and exploit families. I think four mechanisms here. I think first of all, the main interest does happen to be the profit incentive. So also the private business, where if they're a small company, they have to pay their bills. If they're a larger company, they literally get quarterly reporting, so they have quite really strong short-term incentives to price gouge. I think secondly, because we're not beholden to any kind of like price cap, we can kind of capitalize on this niche area, especially since the funeral industry is quite niche. It is quite unknown for under their side. And thirdly, we also have quite a lot of bargaining power. These are families which are in grief. These are families which are kind of like suffering, especially in cases of like sudden death or death with children. But I think just in any case, death is a very sad thing. I think fourthly, we also guilt people into extra spending. So through things like offering extra services, for things like saying, come on, look at these other families, you actually need to buy this, and this. Meanwhile, the government obviously doesn't have that profit incentive. I think what I should actually flag it also is the funeral industry has like huge barriers to entry, especially when you have things like large corporations, especially when you have things like rural towns. I think how does this happen? Four things. I think first of all, obviously depending on scale, a lot of funeral homes just have much greater scale, stopping new competitors coming in. I think secondly, the cost of starting up the actual business is very high, so obviously it just stops people coming. And thirdly, a lot of funeral homes already have like a good existing reputation, which also stops people coming. I think fourthly, we also have things like trademarks and marketing. And even if you buy that we're smaller companies, we also have an incentive to keep prices up because of the incentive, and as it is an inelastic good, something which all people want. Keep it high. Now moving on to my second substantive on why the government will actually do this well, and 6 mechanisms here. I mean, first of all, where the incentive. The context of this is obviously consumers expressing their massive concern. Actually, people just like people waiting people out. I think secondly, it is like a much more. And secondly, I think just a sub point under there, the word incentive is probably very great because death is such a personal thing, it is such a big thing, and also it is something which all people kind of like fear in a way as well. So voters will just express it a lot more, especially when it's like problems like expenses and in the context of cost of living pressure. I think secondly, governments just tend to have much greater expertise and we know how to do this well. Why does this happen? Because we just have much greater access to experts, because obviously it is on a federal level. But also secondly, probably working with government is prestigious. A lot of people apply and they're able to like consult on a much greater range of specialists. I think thirdly, a lot of government politicians actually have like personal experiences with death and funerals. Obviously at some point of their life someone died. So we also really care about reducing the cost and making the experiences better. I think fourthly, there's no alternative body to actually take care of it. Even if they say things like legislation or things like ACCC, I think first of all, it's quite toothless. It is very underfunded. I think second of all, it is very easy to just blame that body. Meanwhile, on our side, comparatively, uniquely, it is the government who has to answer. It is the government who gets voted out or voted in. I think fifthly, the there'll just be like a lot of outrage across both political leanings. I think sixthly, we also get unique media pressure because now it is the government. Compared on that side, even if the media kind of like shit talks the funeral companies, they still get the money because people die and they still and we don't have to change anything because it is in inelastic good. So I think all the impacts of this are sixfold. I think first of all, this just massively reduces price gouging in the funeral industry. It makes the funerals more accessible. It makes funerals better. I think second of all, it actually gives grieving families a lot more autonomy to make informed choices. It actually means that we have greater access to information. It means we actually have people who like care about the word and incentive compared to people who care about getting money from them. I think third of all, it just fulfills a principal obligation of the government to actually help its population. I think fifthly, it also means there's much greater revenue stream, so the government is actually able to access this money and spend this money on things like infrastructure. I think sixthly, also long-term, government cares a lot more long-term compared to these people paying the bill on the day, and that is why I'm proud to affirm.
Thank you very much, First Affirmative, for that fine speech. First Negative will be the exercise.
Side Affirmative is quick to tell you about this whole exploitation of grief, but I just want to ask the simple question. Are you more likely to be exploited by one company or like one body, i.e. the government, or several bodies who are like in competition with each other and are therefore like trying to make prices cheaper, trying to make services better, trying to enter new rural markets and markets for like people who have different funeral arrangements when they have a profit motive as an incentive? Just kind of quickly, that didn't really make any sense, and that's why their case just kind of falls flat. A couple of things on our neg counter model. Secondly, on just why this has reciprocal harms and how the government loses a lot of money. Thirdly, on why we just get a worse funeral system. Fourthly, on why we decrease choice, and fifthly, on why like these corporations are just likely to just kind of be bad. Anyway, so firstly, on the counter model, we tell you a couple of things. Sorry, my time has gone away. Let me tell you a couple of things. Firstly, we're just kind of happy to have a regulatory body that just like make sure that things like price gouging, etc., don't occur on our side. We think notably that if the government is buying every single funeral service available like in the entire country, that is quite a lot of political capital, that is quite a lot of money. We think like a regulatory body is just like okay. Secondly, we tell you that we're happy to subsidize funerals for people who are low SES or disadvantaged and just can't afford them in general. Even if demand continues to be high and like funerals are inelastic as they tell you, we tell you this costs less than nationalising. We're fine to do this on our side, and we have sufficient fiat to do it anyway. So firstly, on this point of substantive, on why we just kind of get a reciprocal harm. Noting here that like the affirmatives model just necessitates one buying up every funeral house ever, like in the country, or like in all of these Western liberal democracies. But secondly, just like continuing to run the industry, which takes people and money. So there's just like a lot of money that the government has to just take away from other things. Noting here, just like weighing this up, this is billions of dollars. Would you pay billions of dollars for like slightly better service? Noting that the will prove why that better service doesn't exist anyway. So what does this look like? Firstly, just governments who are in debt are just now in more debt because and what that means is they're just going to have to spend less on other programs or cut money from other spending. Noting here that this looks like cutting money from things like infrastructure, schools, hospitals, but also things for like welfare, meaning that the government just operates in a worse way and people are likely to be quite angry. Why is this so important? Firstly, just because this impacts everyone. If you are doing things like increasing taxes, if you're doing things like making service worse at hospitals, that is just like fucking horrible. But notably here, the government spending, or most of this government spending, like disproportionately goes to poorer people. People who are going to state schools, people who are accessing welfare. We tell you it is just worse for them. If they want to claim that it is better for people who can't afford a funeral, what about people who now like cannot afford to get good treatment in a hospital, for example, or people who are cut off welfare? Just kind of unclear here. This is so more impactful on our side. Secondly, on just why this is a worse system, a worse and inefficient system in general. Firstly, the thing to note here is that you just like have a new monopoly now, in that there is no competition between firms, noting that the competition between firms is just kind of what kept things like prices down and services better, because obviously there is an incentive for you to like you want people to, use your funeral services. So obviously, like you do this. So there's incentives to do things like get community leaders and people who are like in touch with the communities and decrease prices so poor people can access the market and you can make money off this market. So we tell you that in the comparative, this just kind of goes away under the government. They have no incentive to keep prices low if they are the only person owning all the funerals. We'd also just like to point out that it's just like, the political incentives of government is just misaligned with creating good funeral systems for a few reasons. Even if like government wants to listen to voters, we think that like, first of all, the community doesn't have to, like an individual family or community doesn't have to organize a funeral often. Noting here that like, they tell you that people, like everyone dies, but we'd like to note that everyone dies like only once, in the sense that you're only likely to use a funeral service not very often, unless like, I'm really sorry for you. Anyway, so we tell you that like this is probably not the thing that's going to make or break your political alignment. Secondly, we tell you that like there's just a lot more pressing issues that affect a lot more people more frequently than like a singular funeral. Things like taxing, things like immigration policy, etc. These are more likely to like change your political viewpoints than like this funeral policy. So even if like thirdly, we just tell you there's like there's no incentive for the government to call out bad behavior. Noting here on the comparative that like if you were a corporation, you are likely to call out other corporations for like doing shitty things because it makes you look better and more people are likely to go to your like funeral company then. We tell you the government has no incentive to do this. They look a lot worse. Anyway, a couple of just weird points of rebuttal. They tell you that like on their side you have access to experts in the government. Noting here that firstly that like if you were an expert in the funeral industry and you care a lot about the funeral industry, where would you work? A funeral company? But also second of all, like people in funeral companies are just as likely to have people who've died as people who work in the government. We don't see how that like means anything in the first place. So what is the impact of this argument? Firstly, we tell you that there's just like a decrease in quality of these funeral like this one of this government. Because they don't have the incentives that we do on our side. And we also tell you that it just like simply costs more to run because these funeral companies have been, being funeral companies for a while and know the best ways to work in the industry know how to do that in general. So at the end of this, we tell you there's just a worse system. People are not super likely to hold the government accountable for this because it is quite a small issue and they can get away with quite a lot of things that they wouldn't on our side. Third point of substantive in this speech is just like why people get less choices about funeral companies, etc. So firstly, we just say that firms have an incentive to expand into new markets. What does this look like? This looks like one, going to things like rural areas where there is like, people still die there and but also like entering markets where like there are people who have different religious beliefs or different funeral arrangements because they want to cater to these people. Noting a couple of things. Firstly, if we tell you that this doesn't take much of a toll on like people's voting habits, the government is not likely to care about like different religious arrangements, especially if they're so strapped of cash and so like extractive resources, they're probably going to focus on the most viable thing, whereas companies, if they want to make a profit, will enter these markets anyway. So we tell you, yeah, governments don't have an incentive to do this, corporations do. But secondly, the government is just subject to things like pork barreling, in the sense that they might be more likely to put these services in when a seat is particularly useful for them. And that is just, yeah, that's not good because, yeah, all of these people, yeah. So anyway, we tell you people just have worse choices. And notably here that this is people who are probably messed up by the system anyway, probably don't have funeral services. We tell you that the funeral services for them are better on our side because at least now people have an incentive to cater to. Fifth point of substantive here, which is just like why these government, like these pseudo corporations are just kind of bad. Firstly, there's just an incentive to create bureaucracy because it's the government. Private companies want to make money and they want to make money quickly. The more incentivized to, do things, not get muddled in like bureaucratic processes, and therefore funerals are just likely to work more streamlined and more smoothly to get them done. Secondly, it's just like, governments just like have an incentive to prey on minorities. See, like robo-debt. We don't see why they'd particularly care about minorities, especially if they're not in the large proportion of the voter base. That's the end of my time, so I'm very proud to negate it.
Thank you very much, first review. Second, UTS exams.
You have just heard from the first negative speaker that companies want to make money and make money quickly. We think this is the exact reason why we win this debate, because this proves that the corporations that exist under the negative team's case are money hungry. They are willing to, coerce these poor, vulnerable people who are under, facing grief, and they are thus have incentives to, make money from these people, and we think that is highly coercive. And just on a principle level in this debate, we win for this reason, because we think it is just really, really wrong on a moral principle level for companies to be coercing individuals. So I'm going to do two things in this debate. Firstly, just some rebuttal, and then secondly, go over 2 points. Why we have a twofold benefit to families in terms of both cost benefits and emotional benefits. And secondly, why under our case, we just have informed choice and why we value informed choice principally. So onto some rebuttal. We've heard from the negative team that a government is a really poor actor to, be institutionalizing and nationalizing funeral practices. We've heard from a counter model that they would rather have, they'll make their own board. We have some just general issues with this. Firstly, Nikolai's explained how an alternate board just wouldn't be as, successful. Firstly, due to a lack of capital, we think that the government inherently just has a lot of money that they can push and move around to, legislate this in an equitable and fair way. Secondly, we think that under the issue of informed choice, which I'll talk about in my substantive also, the government has a very central sort of platform in which they can promote information, promote media, that it is accessible for a population as a whole. This leads to more informed choice. We also believe that there are just actual government incentives for them to, prioritize these funeral practice. Nikolai came out at first and was telling you why just socially there is, interest of people to have, cheap funerals, be able to afford and have informed choices. This went unresponded to. We also think that the government is under media scrutiny. There are lobbying groups. They also they want votes. The government needs to be voted in. So I think there's literally incentives to frame policy that is useful for the people. And this is why we think that even if you buy the concept that the negative teams, like separate corporation, could feasibly exist, the government is still the better organization to monitor this because they have more incentives to do so. And they are also just a bigger sort of national body. We'd also just like to briefly touch regarding the government. The negative team was claiming that, the government is going to lose a lot of money. There's a removal of government capital for this, and this is then going to have huge impacts on, infrastructure, education, healthcare. Firstly, we'd just like to point out that they don't really mechanize why this money would necessarily go into infrastructure and healthcare otherwise. We're not sure we really believe that this money would be going to really beneficial things anyway. Secondly, this is just obviously not true. Like if you think empirically, so the government is now sort of making legislation around funerals. They're probably going to then gain money for this, which they can then actually like funnel through. And if we look at it, if we take, the negative team by their best case and sort of they've claimed that, funeral costs aren't actually going to decrease under our side, we think even if funeral costs don't decrease, which is our sort of worst case scenario, we still win for two reasons. Firstly, just more informed choices. Even if prices are the same, we think that if there's sort of legislator that has sort of price caps, legislator that has sort of a general, like what a funeral should look like, then they're less likely to be sort of coerced and less pressure to have add-ons to have like a worthy or a good funeral, and I will touch on this sort of further. And so again, even if they stay the same, so the two reasons, there's less pressure and the legislator makes them more infirmed. And sort of one last piece of rebuttal, we've heard from the negative team that, the corporations aren't going to have the ability to sort of expand into rural areas, and this is going to be sort of really bad for these rural areas. The government's going to sort of target minorities. We sort of just don't understand how this applies. Surely like rural people already have funerals or are already services available to them. But we think again, the government is a sort of body that is voted in. Rural, it doesn't matter whether you live in rural areas or sort of city areas, you do vote for the government. Again, government incentives to actually, want votes from these people and to sort of target practices to these people that they will enjoy. And also to touch briefly on the concept that, the industry is sort of not worth much. People only die once. Thus, it should not be an important concept for the government to focus on. Again, they should focus on better things, healthcare, infrastructure, sort of migrant policies. Sure, people only die once, but people know significantly more than one person. Everyone faces death. We think that death is generally something that everyone is sympathetic towards. Again, this is another reason why the government would be a good body to do this. People in government can have a more sympathetic, more empathetic approach. Again, this was brought up at first and has been unresponded to by the negative team. So again, because death influences everyone, obviously we're not saying migrant policies aren't important, but again, if you want to sort of be best for the majority, everyone faces death, and so thus it is in the government's best interest to create policy that is going to benefit everyone. So linking to this benefits, I'm now going to move on to my substantive. My first point is just how this benefits families. Again, this is twofold. Firstly, cost benefits, second, emotional benefits. So on the first one, cost benefits, Nikolai mechanized this at first, and again, it's been largely unresponded to. We've heard that through the government legislator, we're going to have cheaper funerals through legislative reform. There could be pricing, price caps. And thus, this is then cheaper for families, it's more accessible for the wider community. We also think this will lead to decreased stress amongst, other economic issues such as the housing crisis, which I'll go on to touch after. And also, Nikolai also mentioned this, but we think that the government is able to use the money gained from, these funeral services to then funnel back into sort of society. And this is a really unique thing that occurs under our case that doesn't happen in the negative team's case. This is a point of difference which you should weigh highly in this debate because, again, the government is making funerals cheaper, removing stress, and again, able to use this money to have wider societal benefits, which the negative team was talking about and which the negative teams do value in this debate, which we also achieve arguably better under our case. So second, emotional benefits. We think there's going to be less stress and less emotional guilt under our case. If you look at the US as an example, people are taking out quite frankly insane life insurance policies as they're genuinely fretting that they won't be able to have a funeral. We think that if there is just legislator that says, this is what you need to do, this is the bare minimum, here are the price caps, then there's going to be a much less coercive environment within the actual industry. There's less pressure for add-ons or having sort of a worthy funeral. Again, we don't think you can really attach sort of money to life, and that there's a concept that you need X, Y, Z for a funeral to be worthy or sort of, honor the person who has died. For people who don't have the same, capital to spend on funerals, we think that having government legislation will mean they're much less coerced. They'll feel less guilty about sort of going and doing sort of the bare minimum that is legislated in the government without feeling that they're not doing their deceased sort of person sort of justice in this case. So again, just looking at how this manifests in our world, we have a greater degree of informed choices, I'll go on to prove, and legislation decreases feelings of guilt as there's sort of a point of standard or a point of comparison. So now on to informed choice. Just some framing, we think this is a really important principled argument. The same way that government releases information, say during COVID, about the number of cases, the available vaccines, we think that it is the government's role to, have an informed population so they can choose what they want to do and how they want to go about it. Secondly, again, sort of how Nikolai was explaining, the private sectors are extremely exploitative. They exploit grief and they have monetary incentives to do so, unlike the government, which again, yes, there are monetary incentives, but there are also voter incentives and sort of like empathetic sympathy reasons to do this in a better way than a corporate body that would occur under the negative teams case. So how are mechanizing this more informed? We think there's greater transparency from the government. They're not making an unknown choice between, what does a funeral look like? There is legislation. People are able to choose the basic legal requirements, and the government is a particularly good actor for this, as the info can be contained in a clear space such as a website. And so overall impact under our case, we have more informed choices that won't occur under the negative teams case, and this should be weighed highly for both moral principles and the practicality of just having informed people in the government fulfilling their role in society, and that is why I'm so proud to affirm.
Thank you, Secretary. Secretary, UTS case.
All right, we good to go? Grief is devastating, but the far more important harm in this debate is death. Because death is not only something that causes grief, death is something that ends life. And if fewer people die because there is more welfare, which means people have enough to eat, or because those hospitals that people need are better funded, that means we get far less of the only harm they really have in this debate. Because I would like to know, most of the Western liberal democracies we are talking about are ones that are in debt. England is cutting funding to the NHS every day. Australia has put a freeze on the amount of Centrelink payments they have, and they're dealing with increasing interest payments on the debt that they have. This would require them to spend a huge amount of money, as I will explain, in order to achieve an incredibly marginal benefit, which means either they have to incur more debt so they can't spend more in the future, or they have to reallocate funding away from other things. So why is this, what is the reciprocal harm? Why is it likely to be incredibly expensive? Firstly, you have to buy up a huge amount of these firms. And there's reason to believe this is a particularly large industry because firstly, people die everywhere, all across all of these countries. It's likely to be particularly widespread. But secondly, they say that these firms are currently raking in the profits by scalping money from people, which implies that they do have a decent amount of money and would be decently expensive. Secondly, these firms have maximalist bargaining power when they are being sold. The reason that it is not as if the government can renege, they have to buy them, and so firms have a huge amount of bargaining power on those. So firstly, there is an enormous cost in terms of buying those firms, but there is a second cost, which is the continuing cost of managing these firms, of encouraging oversight, and of not maintaining other industries because you funneled all your bureaucrats to go into there. So why is it the case that these guys will have to cover the operating costs into the future? Firstly, because they say in that second affirmative speech that they will have subsidies on prices, caps on prices. That is government money going into these places here. Secondly, there will be many instances in which these companies are stalling or flagging, like things like economic crises, where the government has to hold on to that asset and juice it up to make sure it doesn't die. And thirdly, since they are making less profit, as this seems to suggest, these firms are making a huge amount of profit right now. As they are making less profit, they now do not have the money or requisite money to cover their operating costs, so it's likely the government has to spend more on that. Why does that immediately win the debate? Because, one, it means they have to prove a very significant harm in terms of everything else in this debate. They can't have a marginal benefit on quality. They've got to have a benefit on quality you would pay billions for in every one of these countries. They don't prove that. But it also means that all of the requisite things for people dying in the first place get worse. And I don't care if grief is something that is likely to be slightly worse under their side. And I'll explain they don't prove that anyway, if it means that more grief occurs, which is something that is obviously more important. Let's now get into the second consideration of this debate, which is, are prices actually likely to go down? And notably, if this pillar falls, they are truly screwed in this debate. It is the only thing they have, and I think they do not prove this. So they suggest that prices are incredibly high and will go down. There are a number of responses. Firstly, the government wants money too, because these guys have suggested that the government is going to use this money in order to subsidize other things it does, which implies that governments have incentives to try and juice this to get more money to fund other things, and also to recoup the initial investment of buying them. But secondly, there are incentives of these people, of the bureaucrats who want to get more money by implying that they have run it so well and raked in a huge amount of profit. That's why robo-debt happened. But notably, there was no alternative for these people. They couldn't go anywhere else because they had a monopoly on these things. Secondly, I think the mechanism that this material is relied upon is backlash, so people would feel backlash if they had to pay slightly more. The problem with this is that, one, it's unclear this is happening in the status quo, right, which implies that it is low, but that secondly, I think the amount of backlash is likely to get worse when the government does it, because there is now, one, you're putting the fox in charge of the hen house, right? The government has incentives in order to look good, to cover up this information, to make sure it doesn't get out, to make sure that that does not occur. But then, thirdly, I would contest that people are getting ripped off in the status quo because this is something that they sort of assert and never prove. Their only mechanism is that these things are inelastic goods. But there are many inelastic goods that exist in which people aren't getting ripped off, and there are good reasons to suggest that people are not, in fact, getting the short end of the stick. Because firstly, it is that this amount of money is likely going towards other services, facts of expansion, facts of hiring more people and growing into new markets that these firms likely do. But secondly, I would contest that the monopolization material this team has. How many funeral homes do you think exist that are enormous conglomerates? Mostly it's just sort of local people that engage in these sort of communities, because what makes you feel most caring is working with people that you know, which is why it's unlikely, I think, that there is an enormous amount of monopolies they have here. And I think they say, well, even small companies want money. That's not necessarily bad. That's money for those good small companies to become better. It's money for them to compete against the better ones. And then I think the last response to this is, if this is the case, we're just happy to regulate these things, give more information that they think is a principle, which I don't believe, via things like the ACCC. And obviously that occurs much more on our side, because when the government does a fuck up, which is the point of the information is to know about when things have gone bad, the government has incentive to obfuscate, to cover it up, and that is not the case when they are in fact the ones regulating this industry. Let's now get into the second question, which is the government actually likely to run these things well? They have a few, broadly three mechanisms for this. The first is that voters care. There are two responses. Firstly, the vast majority of voters don't, because they don't experience death every election cycle, or at the very least they don't pay attention to it. They pay attention to the culture wars. They pay attention to issues of immigration. They pay attention to things like their taxes, which are likely to go up enormously if you have to fund this sort of procedure. So those other concerns are likely to mean that they don't vote on these things, or at the very least that those votes are not actively realistic. The second thing is that governments have expertise. Expertise on what? Driving hearses. Surely this goes the other way. The people who've been running this industry for 20 years have expertise, because they know how to do it, because they've been doing it for so long. Obviously that is something that occurs much more on our side, and I would contest that the government is actually good at running things financially. They are famously bad and laughable at doing that, because they don't have any incentives to do it well, because serious of mismanagement doesn't get actively punished. The third mechanism is that you have media scrutiny. I think the problem with this is you can't have media scrutiny on slower processes or processes of opaque bureaucracy, because what form of media scrutiny are they actually concretely talking about? If your funeral services get slower, how many people have something to compare it to? How many people can know what it was like 2 years ago because they had a funeral service? Most people don't. They go through these things every 20 years, and it's easy to just blame it on inflation, or it's easy to suggest that that is not something that actively happens. So I don't believe that they have any good reason to believe that the governments can run these things well, or at least well enough to compensate for the fact that you're spending this amount of money. But we give you a series of reasons to believe the government is in fact terrible at running these things. Firstly, because they're likely to just mismanage it through things like pork barreling, right? It means that they invest a huge amount of money in the funeral homes in seats that they want to win, which is not the fact that actually helps the most people. And comparatively, the free market is likely to invest in incentives where people are actually experiencing these things, where there is actually the need. Secondly, there is no ability to challenge this monopoly. These companies have incentives right now to give better services in order to get better prices. Because if there are a few companies in a local area, those companies have incentives to say that we can provide you a better service, to say that you can get more money. But I think that they say, well, people are getting ripped off because they're so sort of, they don't believe that these things are sort of helpful to them, or for example, they're going through a lot of grief, so they don't, so they're sort of able to get ripped off. But I think it's the opposite. If you're going through grief and you then are imposed with a huge fine, that makes you fucking angry at these firms. That whips up your hatred in them that you've just gone through all this suffering, and now they're ripping you for every last drop. That is what gets pressure currently. I don't believe this team is able to point to a harm. We point to an enormous one and point to several others in terms of management. Really, really clear win for all.
Thank you very much, second negative. Credit for them who will discuss.
The world that this negative team has to support is one in which private funeral directors and funeral companies can exploit on the grief of families and people who have lost their loved ones. That is a world which principally we do not stand behind. But we explained to you from Nikolai empirically, to little to no response from this negative team, that people in places like the US and Australia have been crying out for decades saying, we need reform. The ACCC has already done things like publish reports. So when the only alternative mechanism that they can point to is things like a regulatory body, that is simply insufficient because those actors are already taking steps like making recommendations in the status quo. That is insufficient. Therefore, that cannot win in this debate. 4 things in this speech. Firstly, responding to the case shift and second negative on why they get more welfare, not proven. Secondly, defeating the counter model. Thirdly, on why we get far better economic outcomes. And finally, on why we are the team that helps the most vulnerable stakeholder. Let's start on more welfare. They explain that the government expenditure on this is huge and that capital would be better redirected to welfare. First thing, nationalisation benefits the government massively because they see a massive return on investment through the billions of dollars that they do get, and we explain to you that it is likely that government's able to redirect this capital to things like infrastructure. Secondly, we explain that firms do not possess the bargaining power empirically they talk about because the government can just nationalise and not have to account for things like loss. Like sure, maybe they do have to buy them out, but they don't have to like overspend to ensure they're doing that. But thirdly, the negative team just does never prove to you why welfare is where this money goes. I think we are the team that is far more charitable because we point to things like infrastructure or energy or even let's just say fossil fuels because those are things that are probably politically a little bit more neutral. Welfare has a terrible rap if you look in contexts like Australia where people talk about dole bludgeons and getting handouts. It is so unclear to me why governments are going to buy into this and why this is politically popular. Noting that teams want to talk about things like electoral incentives, for example. Obviously where there are conservative governments running in places like again, the US and Australia. It is just unclear to me. We think that on our side, our proposition is far more likely because we think things like infrastructure are likely to be cared about. Because firstly, conservatives, even if they're the person we have to appeal to, care about things like social utility and things that benefit the most people. Secondly, again, as I flagged, there's really bad rhetoric around welfare. And thirdly, I would argue to some extent the cost of improving welfare is symmetric to the extent that reforming the welfare system in somewhere like the US, where people have to mortgage their fucking house when they break their leg, is billions of dollars that we're talking about. So, at their best case, maybe they symmetricize costs, but our path to victory still stands because we explain why we get better informed choice, and that was the thing that you had to care about the most. Fourthly, funerals just are not politicized to the same extent as something like welfare, so we explain that to you easy, to little to no response, therefore it is likely to be more politically popular. Fifthly, people are just more sympathetic actors when it comes to death. We've all gone through losing a loved one, we all know what that feels like. Unfortunately, some of us had to be involved in planning funeral arrangements. That is something that even the most conservative political actors can get behind. They just do not prove that when it comes to welfare. So, at the end of that, we defeat their only path to victory, which is that you get more welfare. And even if you think that maybe they could redirect that capital, that is symmetric because that $1 billion cost occurs on both sides. So, we can still win by explaining that we get more informed consent. Let's deal with the counterprop. Their counterprop is twofold. They say, firstly, we get a regulatory body, then they're going to subsidise funerals for lower CS. Firstly, regulatory body, symmetric, because we can also stand for those things when we nationalise this. That that's fine, but they also don't explain why their regulatory body would be done well comparatively. They explain why governments are bad, don't explain why the regulatory body is done substantially better. Secondly, we explain that the government is a far better positioned actor to do this because bodies like the ACCC already exist in the status quo and have been unsuccessful in addressing this issue empirically. But two mechanisms here. Firstly, they just do not possess the same economic capital to do these kinds of change. Secondly, they do not possess the authority to do like policy or what we propose under nationalisation, which is literally a buying out of an entire industry and resource distribution. Obviously, the scale of that is far greater than anything they propose to you. Thirdly, subsidies, I would argue, like, hate to do this, but they're just kind of out of the scope of fiat low-key. But even if you buy that metric, we still win on that metric. Firstly, first part of the issue is that, like, even though cost is a concrete harm to lower CS people, we take that a step further and provide the nuance to explain that it is their inability to make an informed decision that is what is particularly bad. And then we explain, we fix that by doing things like price caps. And secondly, very important mechanism that gets no response from this negative team, too late to respond at third, we explain to you that they can do things like explain to lower CS people what the legal requirements of a funeral are. So, for example, maybe when someone dies, you have to bury them and they explain what those options are, but they can obviously spell that out for people really clearly. Thirdly, they can frame what is an add-on really clearly, so like adding on a flower arrangement to your funeral versus like having to cremate them. And then they say, oh, well, governments are bad. Firstly, I just think they do have policy knowledge and people that are experts in their field. Secondly, we do think media scrutiny is a good mechanism. Firstly, look at the way that the climate change protests, which were demonstrated on Instagram, then informed like our climate target emissions at the federal level. Like obviously things like media scrutiny, like even the way that people have called to free Palestine, that has now meant that we have taken a much stronger stance on that because of people doing things on social media, because of the news scrutinising the Albanese government. Obviously, just empirically, we think that media scrutiny is a far better mechanism, and you have to weigh that against what they tell you, which is private owners ranging from like people working out of their cars on their phone to like, sure, like companies, there's no regulation. So how do we hold those people accountable? And often it's unclear who even owns these companies. So at that point, you can't actually hold the person accountable. Whereas we can say, this political leader made this decision, they can be held accountable. Thirdly, they talk about expanding markets. Firstly, this is far better on our side where governments have electorates in rural and regional communities. They have constituents nationally, so they are far more beholden to them than a funeral company is. And we concretely prove that they are pernicious actors, so they're going to go where the most profit in lies. And even in the found worst case, on the comparative, you say, well, the government still profits. As we explained to you, one, we can redirect that capital, and we are the team that is charitable and explains why we are likely to use that capital in a reasonable way. It's unreasonable that they prove that this goes towards welfare. And we give you concrete mechanisms to explain why governments have incentives to use this capital well on our side. We explain their electoral incentives. Secondly, unlike the counterprop given to you by side negative, we explain that our side is actually politically popular because people are sympathetic to death and because doing things like infrastructure and energy is better. And the funeral industry is not politicised in the same way. So at the end of this, you have to weigh these comparatives under our side. Not only do we get to fulfil the principal obligation to government, which has not been defeated by this negative team, we get better transparency of government, which they cannot claim under their side because the problem in the status quo is that people cannot be held accountable. But we get better scrutiny. That was far better. But finally, on economic outcomes, I think doing some explicit weighing here. Both teams contend the costs are high on either side. But I think in our world, the government gets that money, you can redistribute it. And I think that we've done a far better job of explaining why the government is a better actor than like an independent funeral director. They have no incentive to the people they're dealing with. They only care about themselves, their business, and proliferating their own business. Unclear why they're going to act in a good way. And if in the negative world where private companies get it, the same issues just accrue, then they say, oh, well, there's like monopolies. And I think second negative nukes this by characterizing like the local people that like do the bad behavior. Yes, that's the problem, is that those are the people that are far less regulated. And secondly, it is really hard to apply pressure to those people to change because they are so unregulated. Finally then, on stakeholders, I think I've already dealt with why we are far better for low SES, but we are the team that gets them far better choice. Noting these are people that often have far less education, less knowledge, and due to like their inherent vulnerability, they are the perfect candidate for a private funeral director to pray on and be like, oh, look at this poor family. They've added like all these extra flowers. That would be so nice if you did that too. That still happens under their side. We are the team that fixes that. Even if in our worst case, you think that cost is symmetric, we are the team that gets better informed choice. And that is a principal obligation you ought to stand for, never been prouder to affirm.
the affirmative, the negative.
Good? Okay. Yes, ACCC has made recommendations, but they have not recommended that we should nationalise funeral services, and for a very good reason. It just simply is not the fastest way or the best way to get better prices, to get better quality of services. So, government bureaucrats are very bad at managing, like driving hearses, managing quality of services like that, and the government's job in these sort of industries is to do regulation and to provide information to consumers so they can make informed, reasonable choices. I don't think the government micromanaging every industry is the best way to get good services. I think we're far better on our side. Okay, how I'm going to structure speech. Firstly, I'm going to briefly explain why that principle doesn't apply, then explain why we get better quality of services, why we get better, more affordable prices, and finally talk about our inherent wins we get in space from the get-go, which is just the inherent cost they have to cop of getting nationalisation in the first place, why I think that's better on our side. So, firstly, under their principle, they sort of explain if people are getting exploited because they're grieving, and I guess that's sort of the implication they suggest government adjudicate people, right? Obviously note that is inherently contingent and then actually better caring for people on their side. If people still have expensive funeral services, the quality is worse on their side, they don't achieve this principle. If by contrast, we regulating this industry means people get better services or stay headshot, we obviously have to fulfill their own principle. But all we know the whole idea of grieving families based on heavy emotions, I just ask you, why is people having heavy emotions means they're unable to make decisions about things that matter to them? People having heavy emotions probably means they care an awful lot about the service. Example, people care a lot about weddings and like to spend a lot on weddings because they think it's a very emotional day for them. I think it is the case that people care a lot about something and they should be able to have the choices for what service they want to do for, how they want the service to look like. I think by contrast, on their side, it looks much more like, say, an NHS system where you're stuck on a waiting list, you can't really choose your funeral, you can't choose where you go. I know currently there's different levels of funeral qualities, right? But you get stuck with some random one you're not very happy with, and I'll explain more why I don't actually accommodate you in those aspects. The second thing I also note here, I think their style of exploitation for many people is largely overblown. The first one is obviously for a large set of people who have some form of estate, maybe they owned a house and they retired, maybe they had some superannuation, obviously that is used to cover their funeral services. These families aren't cash strapped with massive groups in those aspects. And the third part knows this, obviously our worst case scenario they try to talk about with like massive life insurance policies, the government on the outside steps in and provides a small subsidy to cover the cost of those funerals in those situations, which means they don't achieve those big harms. And obviously in the note of terms like life insurance, people are obviously going to be buying life insurance anyway, because when if they die at the age of 40 and they have family, they can still cover their employment costs when they still have lots of income, which means they don't actually meaningfully get benefits on their side on that. They can probably still buy life insurance. Probably asymmetric. The fourth part of this principle idea was a note of an informed choice. As in people can't make informed choices currently, presumably if they don't know what the funeral looks like or something. And their analysis here was we'll give them a pamphlet and they can tell them what it looks like. Well, obviously we can just give them a pamphlet. When I go to work and get a new job, I get a pamphlet from Work Choice, from like Fair Work about my obligations on the NES. Presumably we can do the same thing, it's very fine. Obviously we explain at Archie why when you control a funeral service as a government, it looks bad on you if there are scandals, people know sort of those rights, obligations. Probably means we have a strong incentive on our side when you're not involved as heavily to actually probably do that. So if you care about people being informed about the government not being invested, I think we actually are better at managing this principle. I don't think they traditionally prove why this principle applies to such an extent that we ought to do such a big decision, and why small reforms we talk about to improve and fix the industry aren't actually sufficient to fix these problems. Okay, let's talk about quality of services, right? Because I think they note here, they say, like, well, obviously, quality of services is better or stays the same because people have political incentives and sort of backlash stuff. Obviously, we explained quite clearly it's a niche need. Obviously, like niche needs, for example, people in small minority religions probably aren't going to be accommodated by the government just because there isn't a very large voter block behind them, which means the government doesn't have incentive to waste time in those sort of aspects. By contrast, a small company dedicated to those sort of services and say a religious sect obviously can. I think it means those sort of like, different types of services and those sort of aspects is quite good. And why would companies do this? Obviously, incentives. You want to actually capture market share, so you capture certain specific groups and market segmentation, etc. Probably have those incentives. And we also explain death happens rarely. Maybe you have two parents or a child, it means they're not going to vote every election. I think they say people care a lot about death, but obviously that's somewhat symmetric in those aspects. And I also finally need to note, obviously, consider competing interests. Government's a budget surplus. Other things going on probably aren't going to spend all the time worrying about those in those aspects. That's kind of bad. The final thing to note, it's explained to you quite clearly, government services and government standard corporates often just are quite poorly run, often quite unusable. For example, NHS, massive wait list, the MTA New York subway smells like piss and has a huge amount of crime. I just have to say, like, no one's using these services. Obviously, government has incentives, not like they're looking after these services, make them really expensive, what have you, because then it seems like, oh, they're wasting taxpayers' money, on some, family funeral services. When they could just pay for it themselves, seems kind of bad in those aspects. I think that suggests they don't actually get better quality. I think they get worse quality services, and I think that's quite harmful for them. They will talk about exploitation. I think being chucked on a wait list will make you, and not being at a good funeral, having a crappy, coffin will make you feel terrible, make you feel like your parents are being disrespected. I think on their side, that is quite bad. Let's talk about price briefly, right? Because obviously they gave a few reasons why we don't get our competition mechanism. The first one is they suggest it's hard to enter the market, and their reason is like marketing or something. But presumably, you obviously just need to find a coffin supplier, find a morgue who do the embalming for you, talk to a church nearby, and the family obviously can nominate that, and you're good to go enter the market and say talk to some people and start a business, like how any small business starts. I don't see what their cost of entry is. It's not like semiconductors. It's fairly easy to achieve. You don't need massive uni education to do it. Seems fine. They also say, and also know a regulatory body means presumably we have the ability to do some sort of antitrust in the event of severe monopolization that exists, like ACCC. In terms of price elasticity, right, they say you have inelastic demand, which always suggests that these companies need to fight over people because they can't say go find sort of aspects. It means they have to compete on things like having lower prices, competing on lower quality. That means they can't just simply. That means they have to actually fight to get people and to expand their market share, which means they can't just massively exploit in those aspects. That seems kind of bad in those respects. So I don't think they actually explain why price mechanisms don't work. Their contrast is a completing set of claims. It's like the government will want to make money off these people and then put on other aspects, while at the same time saying there'll be price caps, which means they put money in. So I don't quite know how they kind of overlap those two burdens. Presumably they get one or the other. I would just suggest if they take it to the lack of price caps, the one that's getting money from it, suggest they don't get their benefits of exploitation. If it's the price caps, obviously they put lots of money in, which when our other wins actualize, and those are quite important. The final thing to note there is so I think that explains those aspects quite sufficiently where our price stuff, which they don't meaningfully deal with, actually explains we get better service on our side and they don't. It's the reason why telecom was so freaking expensive in the 90s, and it gave shit service because it had no competition, etc. So, okay, let's talk about then one of our strongest path to victory of ignoring those independent positions themselves that win, and that is why it's a waste of time to put them in those other aspects, right? Because obviously, first thing they try to respond to this by saying, well, you get dividends, you get money that way, and actually that's actually a benefit because it means you get money. Obviously, you use tax profits on
on our side. So the scale on their side gap is not very big. I don't know how big these dividends are. You're also assuming these corporations, these bureaucrats, well run. I mean, the health department was like all this money on middle management, etc. on their side because there's no reason to be lean, which means profits probably a much smaller in those aspects. And also the dividends implies price gouging, etc. And so and then obviously then they also say, well, people don't spend on welfare, etc. Because it's not very popular. Obviously, this is one example of government spending being important, useful in other areas. First, it suggests if the government has to pay for these taking over, they probably take money out of wealth on their side to cover the costs to balance the books. But secondly, there's plenty of other examples of things that are very useful and popular, like infrastructure, health services, etc. They probably go with those aspects. They had to defend why this is the best way to invest government money. I think it is not. I think we get a clear win on outside those aspects. So I think the weighing you should then take on this, right, it is very simple and very clear. If you believe that they get slightly more affordable prices, right, I just simply think it's not worth the way up, the cost of other things, but I don't think it doesn't matter. I think we win on price, win on quality, win on all boards, so proud to negate.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the debate. So, free to go.
Like that speech,